Hi, my name is Marcus, and this is a companion podcast for the CG Jung-helpdesk meetup group. I host live events on Zoom every 2 weeks about the concepts and ideas of the Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung. Every event I give a presentation about the Jungian concept, so have fun with this event's topic.
We have a topic for today, which is fantasy and what Jung told us and tried to tell the world about fantasy as a psychological phenomena. So this is not about the literary genre or the movie genre. This is really, what happens when we have fantasies that come up in the psyche and come into our awareness. And Jung talks about that contents can come up from the unconscious into our consciousness, consciousness being our awareness. When we see things, when we experience things, this happens in consciousness. So us being now here in the meeting and being aware of the things that we're doing, this is basically consciousness. But there's always a space outside of that. So that could be like the next apartment or the next room that we could not see right now. Or this can be things that are inside of us, like certain ideas, certain thoughts. And Jung calls this the unconscious because it's not in consciousness. And there's like a movement happening. There's things spilling over from the unconscious, from being outside of our awareness, going into our awareness. And there are different phenomena coming up. And the most obvious one is when we're asleep, that dreams are suddenly coming up. So when we lay down and close our eyes, suddenly images, voices, sounds, and situations come up and we are in them. And Jung equates fantasies with, let's say, living or awake dreams. For dreams, normally we have to sleep. For fantasies, so pictures or situations coming up, like daydreaming, this happens while we were awake. And Jung would not be Jung if he would not take this absolutely seriously and trying to find the reason and understanding for it. So he would look at all parts of human experience and all the things that are happening psychologically to understand, how does the psyche work and what does it mean? And basically also how to deal with it. And he had a quote, which I found very fitting. So I want to show it to you. So, by the way, this format is completely new. I did not have like this elaborate presentations in the past. So in the past, people only had to watch me talk. But now, because I can read out very badly, I started to write this down and put in a nice little presentation. So, by fantasy, we mean something usually quite useless, like a leisure activity for people with time on their hands. One often thinks here's something pathological about it. If someone entertains a fantasy, it is said that they are ripe for the Burkholz sleep. Burkholz sleep being the mental institute where Jung worked at and treated schizophrenics, for example. Yet, no one stops to consider that not a single cultural artifact would exist if it did not grow out of the finest imagining. It must be admitted that fantasy is a game, a creative game. So we already have a lot of stuff in there. What I said, there's something coming up, but there's also something that could be indulged in, and this is normally the understanding of it. But what Jung really pushes hard when he talks about fantasy is really this creative act. And this is that what we have in the world and what there exists comes from human beings if it's human-made, and it first starts with fantasy. So an idea that comes up. And he says fantasy is a potentiality. So it's not only something useless that is happening, but it serves a function and it has a kind of danger to it, which I will get into. So he sees several types of like fantasies that could come up and what they tell us. So I try to cluster it a little bit. Jung, sadly, is not this structured. So he just talks about stuff and he talks about it endlessly and he jumps from concept to concept. And what I try to do is just gather everything that is there available and trying to make it approachable, understandable, and very condensed. So this is really from the 57 books where he mentioned fantasy. And he does not always talk about fantasy. And when he talks about fantasy, it's very often very short. So what we had in the quote, it's start of something creative, that there's nothing man-made, known to you, that is not fantasy, that started as a fantasy, as an idea. Like, I want to conquer all of Asia, or I want to build this house, or I want to get together with this person. So there's already like a thought, an idea there that is then pursued. And this is a really interesting thought to have, to say, okay, a lot of things, like when somebody writes a book, like first he has the idea to write a book, but the book is not completely fully there. It's just the idea. And by spending time with it and engaging with it, more and more stuff pops up. So this is an activation taking place, so that the room is created for not only have a story idea, but suddenly to have characters, to have scenes, to have story arcs, to have interactions, down to single words from chapters, paragraph, sentences, and then different storylines that all happening at the same time. And this all starts with a like little thought and idea in the beginning, but this being then built up again with more and more fantasy that then also just comes up. I know of some British comic book writers who would, for example, act out their characters. So they would dress up like the characters and basically come possessed by them and speaking like them and speaking out loud to develop that story. So to give room to the unconscious to let things happen and come up spontaneously. So fantasies are something spontaneous. And the creative act there is not really that consciousness decides to do something. And Jung hammers this point home very often to say it's not consciousness that does something, that creates something of value, but rather that there's coming something very deep from the layers of the psyche, very often from the collective unconscious. So the layer where all human beings are connected, and which is a very ancient past and existing already for a long time. This is why we can enjoy stories from the past, because our psychology is still the same. Like the story of Troy or Odysseus, like we can still find great joy in that because our psychology is in a sense still the same in the lower levels. And we can have stories and images that are profound in all different cultures and can be understood because there's a connective layer there. And there Jung sees really the ground and source for creative things, and they come up. But if like consciousness tries to do something, Jung does not think highly about that, because very often it's then hyper-subjective, personal, neurotic, or even like propaganda. Like propaganda always feels flat. There's no depth in it. And this is what we say about good things like good art, good music, good stories, that they're deep. And this is because it reaches down really deeply into us and what it means to be a human being and human experience. So consciousness can bring these things forth and create room for that, but not really create them. Human beings are more like a vessel to have these things happening. The second way how Jung talks about fantasy is really as a kind of transcendent function. And Jung's idea is always that our consciousness is small and not comprehensive. Like we don't understand the whole world. We can't act and do everything. We're always limited. We start off limited as small children, and we develop a little bit of knowledge and skills and willpower. And this grows, of course, as we get older, but there's always that we hit a point where we cannot really continue. Like tried everything, and I know this very well from my work, where you've tried everything that you can do, and nothing works. And then something very interesting is happening psychologically. And this he calls the transcendent function, that there's a kind of leap happening. So you have to get a bolt of insight, right? There is suddenly an idea coming up that gives you the next step moving forward and saying like, oh yeah, now I understand. Like I did not have these ideas before, but now I have them, and something changes for that. And this is where Jung sees going into the irrational. So consciousness is being rational and doing things logically and step by step and these different things. But being irrational goes outside of the rules, norms, and all these other things, and something comes from outside. And Jung sees there really the reason for a lot of religious experiences that people have, that there's coming something from the skies and giving like an insight. The Greek had even a god for that, Hermes, who comes from the gods as a messenger to give something to the mortals so that they can do their amazing feats and move on. And this is the interplay that Jung really sees between consciousness and the unconscious, that while you and your conscious are aware, you see things, you reflect on things, you are aware of things, there's always a second partner inside of you, which is the unconscious, that also registers a lot of stuff. And it registers everything that consciousness does not register. And this exchange happens then often during the night, that in dreams the unconscious pushes its contents that consciousness missed into consciousness. But Jung sees here also during the day that fantasy might provide certain things. So this sounds all very abstract. Today we would say, let's brainstorm an idea, right? To say, okay, we don't know what to do. Let's sit together and just keep our minds open, discuss things, throw things in, being then non-critical. This is what he means with being irrational, not being rational in consciousness, but rather to have things suddenly appear and being open for that it's the right thing. And I think, who was it? Bukowski, the writer, who said, write drunk, edit sober. So it's this really writing drunkenly part where fantasy can help out to give new insight about situation which is stuck and could then move forward. Because the unconscious has seen more things than you. It's eternal. It's like old. It's millennia old. It's this very old wise man inside of you that have seen everything, because what we experience is very often situations that human beings have experienced millions of times. So he or she knows what to do and tries to tell you, and you might not be aware to listen. And then you see something more like a diagnostic tool, that is a symptom of a state, that there's just something coming up, which is a reaction to something. And you might be aware even by me telling you stuff about these things, that suddenly certain voices or images come up, ideas that are complementary to what I'm saying. And this is a very often a situation that then occurs, that something comes up. And the reason is then why. And for those who are following John Peterson, he uses that very often in his therapeutic practice, that he would listen to his patients and then say, oh, while you've been telling me that, I had this idea coming up, I had this image coming up. And it's then again like his unconscious telling something and reacting on something. And that can be then used in the conversation. So when you say like, okay, what does it make you think of and how do you feel right now, is already looking inside and being then open for that, same as for fantasy. And I have a little quote about that. When life comes up against an obstacle, so that no adaptation can be achieved and the transference of libido to reality is suspended, then an introversion takes place. That is to say, instead of the libido working towards reality, there's an increased fantasy activity which aims at removing the obstacle, or at least removing it in fantasy, and this may, in time, lead to a practical solution. So Jung very often talks about libido as a kind of energy of the psyche. He does not say it's necessarily real. It's more like a metaphorical concept that best describes what's happening. And he sees that like constantly there's energy coming out of the psyche, libido, that needs to manifest itself. And this manifestation can mean like, okay, you need to eat something, you need to create something, you need to meet someone. And being, let's say, in harmony with the psyche and the unconscious means letting this flow naturally and letting it happen naturally. And when this does not happen, right, all this energy does not move forward, but rather it hits an obstacle and then it goes inside. So instead of going out of the psyche, it stays in the psyche and can create a lot of trouble. Similar with the car, right? If you hit the gas pedal, the car wants to move forward. But if you have the handbrake on, like all this energy will stay kind of in the car and it will put a huge strain on the system. And what Jung would try to do in his practice would try to find out what is the obstacle that is hindering the person from moving forward. very often some kind of responsibility they don't want to take care of, and something they need to do, but they shirk the responsibility and they don't want to do it. So all this libido that should move forward is moving backward and is activating a lot of stuff in their psyche. And this can be then used as a diagnostic tool to describe the state the patient is in. So these fantasies are not random. They are specific to the person and their situation, but of course they're hard to understand. And this is then what Jung would do. But at the same time, they can also be used as a kind of training ground, as Jung writes here, that when an obstacle cannot be overcome for real, that this kind of daydreaming, this brainstorming process starts, where the mind kind of simulates this situation and how to potentially overcome it. And at this point, I have to say always that like Peterson is a 100% Jungian, because he talks about this very often. He says like, oh yeah, consciousness and the mind and the intellect that we have is kind of a simulation where we can let our ideas die instead of us. We can simulate a situation, how we would deal with it, and already anticipate how it would turn out so that we can get rid of bad ideas. Instead of us dying in the real world by just trying everything out immediately, we can think and reflect, okay, how would I approach this and how would I do it without being harmed? And this is exactly like Jung meant. Either he got the same parallel idea as Jung, or he read it with Jung. Very likely he read it from Jung. So how would the interaction between fantasy and consciousness look like? One, of course, negative example would be becoming completely overwhelmed. This cannot be forgotten. The unconscious is always stronger, more ancient, and more knowledgeable than consciousness. And what can happen is that these unconscious contents just overrun consciousness, which means that the person cannot really live its normal life anymore, but rather is completely flooded and fascinated by images. So we're talking here in the Jungian sense from schizophrenics, where Jung says that it's just these internal contents being so strong and so overwhelming and so fascinating that they distract the person from the outside world. Jung calls schizophrenia even a dream process that does not stop. So the things that are happening at night are suddenly happening during the day, and they're so strong that the person is not reacting to the outside world anymore. So for Jung, schizophrenia is very much related to catatonia, so really not being approachable for the outside world anymore. A less severe case would be indulging in them. So a fantasy can also be a very pleasant thing, right? A daydreaming, that you have a fantasy of being rich, famous. And if it's just this playing around, indulging in it, not really engaging with it, engaging meaning transforming it and reflecting on it and trying to integrate it and understand where it's coming from, but rather having this idea and being very much engrossed by it. So what Jung in general advises is to confront unconscious contents. So to not take things from the unconscious unquestionably, but rather think, what does it mean? Where does it come from? And not immediately believe what's there. So when he approaches dream interpretation, he says, never take it literally, but symbolically. It means something, and very likely you just don't understand what it means. So indulging with them and just taking them as they are is already a kind of closed loop. You do not really get out of that. And if you're being overwhelmed by certain fantasies, ideas, he says the best way is to confront them and go on them head on. And this is also very often why it's important to have some outside person to talk to. Like the therapist is there in this setting to tell the person like, okay, yeah, this is like a not so good idea. You tell everyone as lizard people and they're trying to get you. So maybe we should talk about that. Or being completely flooded, overwhelmed, and not being able to function normally in the world, to engage this head on. And this is like the difficult part in Jungian psychology, because he says, okay, go there where the pain is and where the dangerous thing is. Like people are aware of the shadow, and shadow integration is always like, don't run away from the scary thing, but engage with the scary thing so that it transforms. And I have a super cool story that I really like to tell, how Jung approached this. And there was a story of a patient. So Jung, as a Swiss doctor, had to also help in the army. And he lived through the First and Second World War. And he helped their soldiers with psychological experience that they had. And he says, when somebody dreams of a situation and it's carbon copies the exact same situation that they experience in the real world, it means it does not get processed. And it means like it's completely blocking the psyche. And an example he very often had was soldiers being shell-shocked. So they were attacked with artillery and like comrades died and they were injured and all these things. And people got PTSD. They got traumatized. And when people then dream, it's always this dream of the same situation, and literally as it happened. And as I said, like dreams are not literal. Dreams are symbolic, which means if they're not symbolic, like completely unprocessed, like the psyche does not know what to do with it. So he would talk with the soldiers through it, and through the therapy and through the talking, the dreams would transform because consciousness would change. And dreams are always a reaction to consciousness. And suddenly it was not this loud bang of an artillery shell, but rather suddenly a lion that would attack the soldier. And this also does not sound so nice that a lion tries to eat you in your dreams, but at least a lion is physical. You can interact with a lion. You could fight off a lion. A sound like an artillery shell, there's nothing you can do. It's just almighty and it appears in a flash and destroys everything. But a lion, you can fight. And this was always be the progress. And through the therapy, that would transform even further. So with time, it would become a kitten. And a kitten, you can have a completely different relationship than with a lion. And this would already be the sign that the soldier is on the right path and the therapy is working. And that's what I mean with engaging with the fantasy, engaging with the contents. They're not supposed to be like they come up. They need to be transformed. But for that, it needs to be consciousness reflecting on them. So giving them space to appear, but then reflecting on them, dissecting them, trying to integrate it, trying to relate, okay, why have this fantasy? Have I have this idea? And so this is what he would also recommend to his patients, to engage with the fantasies that are coming up when they're distracting. So like, you think everybody is lizard people? Let's talk about it. Why do you think everybody is lizard people? And this might already transform the fantasy and remove the patient from that so that they don't come identical with these contents coming up. And the third part is, of course, materializing. So when there's a fantasy, to then do it. Like, oh, I want to build a house. Let's build a house. I really want to go to Morocco. Let's go to Morocco. I want to be together with this person. Let's do that. This is what he then calls the creative act. Now, okay, this is for the therapy setting. It's a very nice quote. In mental disorder, for instance, you have to start by strengthening the ego. So consciousness, you as a person. Sometimes it is necessary to say with vigor, come on, that's just a fantasy. First of all, the fantasy is devalued by this. The ego and the vision are torn apart. A distance is put between them. Sometimes you have to take very drastic measures to bring about the differentiation. So it can be necessary to shout at somebody to wake him up when he is drifting into a kind of collective sleep, or to grab hold of people and shake them so that they know who they are, or slap or shove them can work wonders so that the person feels, this is me. There are circumstances where a good smack, morally or physically, is the most effective way to counter the great fascination of images. So I don't know whether this is still a standard practice today to slap your patients when it's necessary, but it seems like Jung was an advocate 100 years ago. But this is what I mean. Like, it's very easy to get lost in the images and the fantasies and the unconscious. And to get a distance there, it's sometimes also helpful to have someone else. It doesn't have to be a smack, but if somebody tells you, especially someone who's close to you, like, you're being stupid right now, this can already be helpful to say, okay, there's something not going correctly right now. And on being creative, there's a tremendous urge in a creative mind to get the product of the fantasy down in some relatively permanent form in order to hold it. So that means writing a book, writing a song, like being fascinated by something. And I hope all of you sometimes had this experience of saying, oh yeah, I'm really gripped, I want to do something. And even if it's just like gardening, like, oh, I want to have this plant and I want to make this. And this is then like the unconscious and an urge and a wish coming from the inside to do something. And those are the situations where you can really do stuff for a very, very long time. If there's something you don't want to do, it's incredibly hard. Like you get bored and tired after 3 minutes. But if it's fascinating and you already have the idea, oh, I want to do this, I want to create that, this can last for hours, days, weeks, months. And this is then this energy, the libido coming from the unconscious to bring something into this world. And if it comes from a deep enough place, it's then also fascinating to other people because they can connect with it. And this is how we get great works of literature, great movies, great songs, theater, sculptures, everything. And how Jung would use it in his practice is perhaps you suffer from an abominable headache, a pressure in your head, and your analyst suggests that you make a fantasy or drawing about it so you can produce an amazing drawing, all sorts of illusionary things, and your headache is gone. And this is what Jung means, like the libido being trapped inside the psyche, inside the person, and it needs to go outside. It needs to be materialized. And he would do that very often to let his patients draw. And this drawing process is already bringing things into consciousness and reflecting on them and giving them a concrete form, because in the unconscious, everything is very vague, shadowy, inconcrete, but suddenly you have a form, and a form you can recognize and play with. And so this is like releasing the handbrake. The car can drive forward, and the energy is not trapped in the thing and ripping it apart. Another quote: I have found that the existence of unrealized unconscious fantasies increases the frequencies and intensities of dreams, and that what these fantasies are made conscious, the dreams change their character and become weaker and less frequent. From this, I have drawn the conclusion that dreams often contain fantasies which want to become conscious. The sources of dreams are often repressed instincts which have a natural tendency to influence the conscious mind. And Jung very often talks about this, especially in the context of individuation, so to become oneself, to develop as oneself. There are certain things just coming up, and you have to deal with them, but you also have to follow them, because the psyche provides energy for them, and it's supposed to go there. And if you don't go there and put the energy where it's supposed to be, like it will pop up in all these weird places and create trouble. And there will be a standstill till this is removed as an obstacle. And this is an experience I also have, and I noticed more and more recently, that I have a certain thought or idea, for example, of the things I want to do, or like I'm being told to do from the psyche. And it lingers then around for me for weeks or months, and it's kind of blocking. And if you do it, suddenly new things pop up. And there are things that seem obvious in retrospect, but they were blocked by the other thing. So the psyche has a little bit like a step-for-step process for you in mind, and you have to follow along. This is why Jung says individuation is pretty easy. You only have to do the next logical step. So it's a huge journey that takes a lifelong and longer, but it starts with one step, and it's then always one step at a time. And it's, of course, not doing the thing unquestionably, but rather contending with it, taking the unconscious content, reflecting on it, trying to materialize it, and then see how everything changes. I have an example. So what I reference Peterson a lot, but Peterson says like clean your room. And what I really tried in April was to clean my apartment like very, very thoroughly. And I tried to find things that I could clean and repair. And there were things I've seen for years, but like I see them and forgot about them immediately. The weird thing is I could make a list like, oh, then these are the 5-6 things that bother me in my apartment and I need to fix. And I had always this list in my mind. I sat down and said like, okay, good. I will fix all of those things. And as I start fixing them, I started to find more things where I think like, oh yeah, this I also wanted to fix. Oh, this I wanted to repair. Oh, there is this thing that bothered me already forever. And it is like Jacob's ladder. And this is what Peterson's talking about a lot recently, is there's always another step. There's always more stuff coming, but you don't see it until you have done the first, the second, the third step. It's blocked. Everything is blocked until you did these first things. And I was surprised. Like every day I would go into my apartment and think like, okay, what can I do? Right? And I would do the things that I noticed and suddenly pop, new things I would notice. And it was crazy. It was a little bit like magic because every time the apartment would shift and transform because my perception would change. So it was a really cool and interesting experience. So by now I think I really have done everything because like an apartment is limited. But it's interesting to think about like, okay, what else could this be applied to? Like, where are you blind because you did not take the necessary step yet? So what are the differences to other psychological phenomena? Because it's not that fantasies are the only things coming up, right? There are a lot of things coming up. Dreams are already mentioned in the sleeping state. But like, yeah, Marcus, what about symbols? Like symbols come from the unconscious and they also have a meaning and they're assigned where to develop to and they have a deep meaning. Yeah, so symbol is a little bit different in the sense that there are really a lot of depth inside. So it's a little bit like a dragon's tail. You don't see the whole dragon, you only see the tail and you have to follow kind of unfolding the symbol. And symbol come up very often in dreams. It seems like Jung sees fantasies as something more immediate and basic that comes up like a thought or an image or like an idea. But dreams being really these dramas that you have to follow for weeks and months and you can unpack with all these different aspects. There's just way more in a dream. And when he talks about symbols, this is very often in a dream context or like in a cultural context, like the symbol of the cross, the Christian cross. There's a lot to unpack there. And it's possible that it maybe came up as a fantasy somewhere, but Jung sees there more depth than in just a fantasy, or like a fantasy as a stepping stone to things. Yeah, but it's also possible that a symbol can come up in a fantasy. So yeah, I did a whole event about symbols to explain a little bit more there, because a symbol is already like an attempt to bridge conscious and the unconscious. For hallucinations, Jung talks about mainly in an auditory sense. So when he has schizophrenics who hear voices, he would say, okay, this is rather split off parts of consciousness that are not connected anymore to consciousness. So this is why you hear voices. Like when you think, you also hear your own voice, right? But if consciousness is already so fractured, it's part that you can hear voices from other parts of your psyche where you think it's something else, but actually it's you. But hallucinations he mentions very, very, very rarely. And for visions, so he did a whole seminar on visions where he took apart like the dream visions of a patient of his. And those are also way more complicated in the sense of, for him, a vision is already like a drama, but like a world-creating drama. He would differentiate a dream and a vision by saying whether the person physically is there. Very often in your dreams, you are physically there, which means you're doing something is happening to you. For example, like the lion attacks you, that means you're physically there. You're moving around, things are happening to you, you have a feeling of being a person in there. But he says in a vision, you are completely bodiless. You're more like a camera in a movie. You're just existing something and it's not really interacting with you. You're observing it. And he says very often visions are a kind of world creation, so that they start from scratch. So you have like primordial water and the world is being created out of that. And that you have this whole story of creation in different ways. So, for example, the vision that Jung had before World War I, where he saw Europe drowning in blood and corpses, roughly half a year before the war started, that was a vision, because it was not like Jung standing at the street and then seeing this, but he said, like, I was seeing the whole of Europe and all these horrible things were happening, there's a different scale to it. It's not a human scale, but it's something way grander. And the feeling is also then very grander and memorable. So this is not exactly a fantasy, but rather something that is way more, attention grabbing. All right, I would try to sum it all up and conclude it. So this is not Jung, this is me. And I would say like fantasy is an important part of psychological experience, which can be useful or destructive based off how one interacts with it. It gives insight into one's psychological state and can bring new things into this world. And this is a point that Jung always tries to hammer down. Everything is kind of a duality. It's a little bit ambivalent. It can be good or it can be bad. And very often it's about how we interact with it. When you indulge in the fantasy that there's lizard people out there to get you, like that's a bad fantasy. That's not so good. But if it's like bringing you to write a very good book about lizard people that's profound and talking about the human experience, then this is then something, let's say, useful. And Jung would always approach it like that. It's not good or bad. The question is what we make of it and how we react on it. And the important thing is not try to get blocked by it, but engaging it even when it looks scary. And this creates this drive for the individuation process of developing as a person and to develop into oneself. And of course, this sounds now very rational and very easy, but if you're caught with a fantasy that like horrible things are happening, like people being out there to get you, or like, oh, at work, they're trying to get rid of me and stuff like that, this can hugely influence a person's life. And one must be aware of that and not be caught of that. And again, this is very easy when you're outside looking at it. But if you're caught in that, in a bad thought, a bad mood, a bad idea, like getting out of that is incredibly, incredibly difficult. And Jung would always say, okay, you need other people. You need a relationship to other people so that they can point these things out. This is why he, for example, says dream interpretation can't be done alone. It needs an outside person because a dream tells you things you do not know and understand. So you need another person just to point things out. But also to watch one's dreams and be aware, like have a little bit of humility and say like, okay, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this is stupid. Maybe one needs a good smack at the head to say like, okay, yeah, this is actually not how one should think and I should not take this seriously. But again, incredibly hard. All right. And that would conclude my presentation about fantasy. And I'm surprised because it got somehow way longer than I anticipated. But I hope you had fun. I hope it was understandable. And this would bring the second part of the event. And I want to thank you all for your attention and your time on this very fine Wednesday evening. This was this event's topic. Thanks for tuning in. If you're interested in learning more about Jung, please check out the description.